September 25, 1986. 3 p.m. A ridge northeast of Jalalabad, Afghanistan. Engineer Ghaffar pressed his back against the rock. Below him, the Jalalabad air base shimmered in the autumn heat. He had 12 men, 3 missile launchers, and 6 years of watching his country burn from above. The Soviet Mi-24 Hind gunships had been doing it since 1979. Flying low, flying slow, flying without fear. Because no one could stop them, the Mujahideen had tried. With rifles, with machine guns, with captured Soviet missiles. The Hinds absorbed it all. The titanium armor laughed at everything the rebels could throw. At 3 p.m., 8 Mi-24D Hinds descended toward the runway. Ghaffar watched through the sight. He pressed the uncage button. A low tone filled his headphones. Lock. He pulled the trigger. The first shot misfired. It slid from the tube and clattered uselessly into the rocks. Ghaffar did not move. He nodded to his second team. The second missile ignited. Mach 2.54, 2.5 times the speed of sound. It tracked the lead Hind. And then the sky broke open. The Soviet pilots had been laughing at the Afghan rebels for 6 years. They were not laughing anymore. Captain Nikolai Vlasov had a name for his helicopter. He called it the Crocodile. Most Soviet pilots did. The Mi-24 Hind earned the name. Titanium-armored cockpit. Bulletproof glass. Redundant flight controls built to absorb punishment. Capable of carrying 8 fully armed soldiers into battle. And killing everything within range once it got there. When the Soviet 40th Army entered Afghanistan in December 1979, the Hind was their most decisive weapon. Soviet military planners had assessed the situation with contempt. 80,000 troops, 2 to 3 years. Against barefoot fighters armed with 50-year-old rifles. General Alexei Yepeshev, Moscow's top military political officer, flew to Kabul in April 1979 to assess the enemy. His conclusion was delivered without hesitation. The Afghan army is failing because of poor ideological outlook. Not because the Mujahideen are capable fighters. General Alexei Yepeshev, Kabul, April 1979. For 6 years, that confidence seemed justified. Pairs of Hinds would sweep valley floors at under 100 meters, destroying villages, burning irrigation networks, seeding mountain passes with PFM-1 butterfly mines. The Mujahideen had DSHK heavy machine guns. They had captured SA-7 missiles. They fired everything they had at the Crocodile. The titanium absorbed it. The Hinds kept flying. Soviet air crews dismissed the rebels in their memoirs. Barefoot men who could not scratch the armor of a modern attack helicopter. The 40th Army controlled the sky. And in mountain warfare, the sky is everything. But something was coming. From Langley, Virginia. In 1985, a congressman from Texas named Charlie Wilson walked into CIA headquarters with one question. What would it take to bring down a Hind? Operation Cyclone had been running since 1979. The CIA's most expensive covert operation in history. They had been funneling weapons through Pakistan's ISI, Soviet-style arms, Egyptian rifles, Chinese mortars. Anything that couldn't be traced back to Washington. Plausible deniability. The doctrine that had guided the entire operation. But by 1985, the Soviets had changed tactics. Elite Spetsnaz units, integrated air assaults, systematically cutting the Pakistani supply routes. The Mujahideen were losing ground. Wilson, CIA Director William Casey, and a young paramilitary officer named Michael Vickers argued for a radical escalation. Give the Mujahideen the FIM-92 Stinger. A fire-and-forget shoulder-fired missile. Infrared guidance. Supersonic. All-weather. American-made. Classified. The opposition was fierce. State Department officials warned it would destroy plausible deniability. The Joint Chiefs feared Soviet retaliation against Pakistan. CIA officers warned the technology could fall to radical factions who might turn it against Western airliners. The debate raged for months. Vickers settled it with mathematics. One Mi-24 Hind, $10 million. One FIM-92 Stinger missile, $75,000. 133 to 1. That was the exchange ratio. A massive increase in the quality and quantity of weapons, including the Stinger, could break the military stalemate and force a complete Soviet withdrawal. Michael Vickers, CIA paramilitary officer, 1985. In early 1986, President Ronald Reagan signed the directive. Pakistan's ISI built a classified training facility at Ojri Camp. Colonel Mahmoud Ghazi, a Pakistani air defense officer trained personally in Washington, ran the school. 2 weeks, 12 fighters per class. Engineer Ghaffar was among the first graduates. In July 1986, the first crates of Stingers crossed into Afghanistan. The Soviet Air Force had 2 months left of ruling the sky. Before we get to what happened next, if you believe these stories deserve to be told, if you think the history of how America fought and won the Cold War is worth remembering, subscribe to Cold War Confidential. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because this story is about to get a lot better. September 25, 1986. 3 in the afternoon. Jalalabad Air Base, Eastern Afghanistan. 8 Mi-24D Hinds descended toward the runway in formation. Standard approach, routine mission. No one on those helicopters was concerned. Ghaffar's 3 teams were positioned in a triangular ambush on the high ground northeast of the runway. Exactly as trained. Colonel Ghazi was there too, hidden in the rocks, watching. Each launcher was cooled with liquid argon, chilling the infrared sensor to its operating temperature. The IFF antenna searched for friendly transponders. Found none. A low warbling tone in the headphones. Thermal lock on the Hind's engine exhaust. Ghaffar pressed the uncage button. Pulled the trigger. The first missile slipped from the tube, fell dead into the rocks. He nodded. The second team fired. The motor ignited. Mach 2.54. The missile tracked the heat signature of the lead helicopter and detonated directly into the fuselage. The Mi-24D erupted into a fireball and fell onto the tarmac. The third and fourth shots followed seconds later. A second Hind disintegrated mid-air as its ammunition detonated. A third crashed in flames near the runway. The CIA had provided Ghaffar with a Sony video camera. The footage showed his men jumping, screaming, weeping. 3 burning circles of Soviet steel on the runway below. The next morning, a KH-11 spy satellite passed over Jalalabad. High-resolution imagery confirmed 3 destroyed aircraft. The tape was flown to Washington and screened for President Ronald Reagan in the White House. Soviet air traffic in the region was immediately suspended. Commanders had no explanation. Their invincible helicopter had been shot down by a rebel holding a tube. What followed was not just a military reversal. It was a psychological collapse. Soviet commanders imposed an immediate flight floor order. All aircraft were to fly above 11,500 feet. Above the Stinger's effective ceiling, Soviet ground troops began calling their own pilots cosmonauts, because they were too high to be useful. High-altitude bombing runs missed Mujahideen positions by hundreds of meters. Close air support, the tactical foundation of the 40th Army, became functionally useless. Helicopter crews began welding extra steel plates to their cockpit floors, reducing payload, reducing performance, accepting degradation just to feel slightly less exposed. Memoirs from Soviet Afghansi, veterans of the Afghan War, describe pilots claiming engine anomalies to avoid missions in valleys known to have Stinger teams. When a lead helicopter was shot down, the remaining aircraft would climb and leave, abandoning Soviet infantry in the field, without air cover, alone. The Stinger destroyed the tactical system that we relied upon to control the Afghan interior. Without low-altitude aviation, we had no way to project power into the mountains. Soviet 40th Army officers, declassified post-war assessments. By 1989, CIA estimates credited the Stinger with 269 kills in 340 engagements, a 79% success rate. Post-Soviet archives tell a more conservative story. 118 fixed-wing aircraft, 333 helicopters, over 10 years, from all causes. Historians debate the exact numbers. The Soviet commanders did not debate them. They knew what they had lost. February 15, 1989. The Friendship Bridge. Spanning the Amu Darya River between Afghanistan and Soviet Uzbekistan. Lieutenant General Boris Gromov rode the last Soviet armored personnel carrier across the steel span. Halfway across, he climbed down and walked the rest of the way on foot. His 14-year-old son Maxim was waiting on the Soviet side, holding a bouquet of red carnations. Gromov turned to face the cameras. "There is not a single Soviet serviceman left behind my back." Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, February 15, 1989. It was a lie. Declassified records confirmed that at least 226 Soviet soldiers remained in Afghanistan. Captured, deserted, absorbed into Afghan tribal life. Men who had taken new names, built new lives, in mud-walled homes in the country that had defeated their army. But Moscow needed the moment. Gorbachev had called the war a bleeding wound at the Party Congress in 1986. The same year the Stinger arrived. The political decision to leave had been made before the missile changed the war. But the Stinger had made staying impossible. In private, Soviet generals said what Gromov could not say publicly. The Stinger had cut the supply lines, crippled the border interdiction mission, allowed the Mujahideen to regenerate indefinitely from Pakistan. They could not win without the sky, and the sky no longer belonged to them. The legacy extended far beyond Afghanistan. Every military on Earth redesigned its aviation doctrine. Flight floors were raised. Standoff munitions were developed. Infrared countermeasures became standard on every combat aircraft. UAVs began replacing manned low-altitude attack missions. The Stinger had proven a single equation. A $75,000 missile could deny the sky to a $10 million helicopter. And a superpower that cannot project air power cannot project power at all. Operation Cyclone would later generate its own reckoning. Hundreds of Stingers unaccounted for. The CIA spent millions in the 90s trying to buy them back from the same networks it had armed. Blowback. The word that would define the next chapter of American foreign policy. But on September 25, 1986, on a ridgeline outside Jalalabad, one man with a tube on his shoulder fired a missile that cost $75,000 and ended an empire's air war. The Soviets had laughed at the Afghan rebels for 6 years. 3 years later, they were gone. If you made it this far, you already know. History is not made by governments or doctrines. It's made by decisions, by men willing to take a risk when everyone else said no. Cold War Confidential exists to tell those stories. The ones that changed everything. The ones they almost kept classified. subscribe, like, share this, because the Cold War is full of stories like this one, and you haven't heard half of them yet.